Welcome to The Taken Hour, your sanctuary for bedtime stories from beyond the stars. If you find peace in these nocturnal journeys, please consider subscribing to join us every night. Now, let go of the day and settle in. The gentle hum of the electric heater was the only sound in the observation outpost, a small, insulated bubble of warmth perched on the edge of the sprawling ancient forest. Elias, the forester, charged with monitoring this vast expanse of trees, sat in his worn armchair, a mug of herbal tea steaming softly in his hands. Outside, the world was drenched in the absolute indigo ink of a moonless night. The forest was asleep, or so it seemed to the naked eye. But Elias knew better. He knew the secret life that began when the sun went down, a life revealed only by the glowing screens arrayed before him. He took a slow sip of tea, feeling the warmth travel down his chest, matching the gentle heat of the cabin. His job was one of quiet solitude, a rhythmic vigil that he had come to cherish. There was a meditative quality to watching the monitors, a soothing predictability. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was simply bearing witness to the nocturnal rhythms of the wild. His primary tool was the thermal imaging array mounted on the roof, a sophisticated camera that translated heat into a shifting landscape of color. It turned the impenetrable darkness into a vibrant tapestry of oranges, reds, and purples, revealing the hidden warmth of living things against the cool backdrop of the sleeping earth. It was a comforting spectrum, a visual lullaby of nature's enduring energy. Elias adjusted the dials, bringing the thermal image into sharper focus. The screen directly in front of him showed a wide sweep of the tree line, about 100 yards from the cabin. Tonight, the baseline temperature of the air and the trees was a gradient of deep blues and cool magentas. The trees stood like frozen veins against the sky. It was a quiet night. Usually, by this hour, he would have tracked the fiery orange signature of a deer herd moving toward the stream, or the smaller, intense red pulse of a fox on the prowl. But tonight, the forest seemed to be holding its breath, suspended in a state of deep, cool rest. The silence in the cabin was amplified by the visual stillness on the screens. It was peaceful. He leaned back, letting his eyes unfocus slightly, allowing the colors on the screen to blur into an abstract painting. The rhythmic blinking of a small green status light on the console was hypnotic. Sleep was beginning to tug at the corners of his mind, a gentle weight on his eyelids. He welcomed it. This transition state between wakefulness and dreams was his favorite part of the night shift, where reality felt malleable and soft. The forest outside was a giant cradle, and he was safe within its ancient wooden arms. He decided he would do one more routine scan of the perimeter before letting himself drift into a light doze. His hand moved automatically to the joystick controller, panning the rooftop camera slowly to the east. The motorized camera swiveled silently on the roof. On the screen, the world slid sideways in a wash of cool colors. The dense patch of pines near the creek bed rolled past. Nothing. The rocky outcrop that retained heat from the day, usually a glowing yellow island in the blue sea of the night, was cool tonight, barely registering a difference from the surrounding air. The camera continued its slow sweep toward the northern ridge, an area seldom visited by large animals due to the steep terrain. Elias watched the screen with half-closed eyes, expecting the same monotonous calm. The camera completed its arc and settled on the dense canopy of the ridge. He was about to turn away when a subtle shift in the color palette caught his attention. It wasn't a flare of heat, which is what the eye is trained to look for in thermal imaging. It was the opposite. In the center of the screen, amidst the uniform cool purple of the pine needles, there was a patch of deeper, darker color. It was a profound, almost velvety black blue, indicating a temperature significantly lower than the surrounding environment. It looked like a void, a hole punched through the thermal fabric of the night. Elias frowned slightly, blinking away his drowsiness. He leaned closer to the screen. Perhaps it was a glitch in the sensor, a momentary calibration error. He tapped the refresh button, forcing the system to recalibrate its baseline. The screen flickered for a microsecond, but when the image stabilized, the dark patch remained. He zoomed in. The optical lens adjusted, and the dark anomaly grew larger on the screen. It wasn't a perfect circle, nor was it irregular like a natural rock formation. It had a smooth, almost liquid edge, like a drop of ink dispersing in water, yet it held its shape. It was hovering, or perhaps resting, just above the treetops on the ridgeline. Elias checked the environmental readings on a secondary display. The outside air temperature was a steady 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He moved the measurement cursor over the dark patch on the main screen. The readout fluctuated wildly for a moment before settling. The reading made no sense. It was registering 20 degrees below zero. A localized pocket of air, 60 degrees colder than its surroundings, hovering over the forest. It defied basic meteorology. Yet there it was, a serene pool of impossible cold, recorded by a machine that didn't know how to lie. Elias felt a prickle of curiosity, a sensation that was pure and undiluted by fear. It was too strange to be frightening. It was simply a puzzle, a beautiful, silent anomaly in the familiar pattern of his night. He watched it for several minutes. It didn't shimmer or pulse. It just existed, a void of heat in a landscape of cool life. He found himself captivated by its stillness. It was smoother than the wind, quieter than the trees. He decided to switch to the optical camera, the one that saw visible light, just to confirm there wasn't some physical obstruction, perhaps a weather balloon snagged in the branches. He toggled the switch. The screen went completely black, save for the faint digital overlay of the time and compass heading. The naked eye could see nothing out there but the crushing dark of the forest. There was no moon to cast shadows, no clouds to reflect starlight. He switched back to thermal. The beautiful, impossible cold spot was still there, glowing in its absence of heat. It was a ghost that only the machine could see, a shadow not of light, but of temperature. Elias settled back into his chair, his tea now lukewarm. He didn't reach for his logbook to record the event. not yet. This felt like something that needed to be observed, not catalogued. It felt private, a secret being shared between the forest and the observer. He watched as the digital clock on the corner of the screen ticked away the minutes. The anomaly remained perfectly stationary for nearly half an hour. Then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to change. It wasn't dissipating, it was moving. The dark blue shape was drifting to the left, sliding smoothly over the canopy like a drop of oil on glass, heading slowly down the ridge toward the valley floor. Its movement was impossibly smooth, lacking the bobbing gait of an animal or the chaotic tumbling of wind-blown debris. It glided. Elias tracked it with the camera, keeping the cold singularity centered on his screen. As it moved lower down the ridge, it passed behind a tall stand of old-growth pines. On the thermal display, the warmer, orangish trunks of the trees briefly obscured the deep blue shape, confirming it was indeed physical, occupying space within the forest, not just a glitch on the lens. It emerged on the other side, unchanged, continuing its slow, deliberate descent toward the deeper woods. He felt a strange sense of kinship with the silent traveler. In this vast, sleeping wilderness, they were the only two things awake and moving. One observing from a warm glass bubble, the other a drifting enigma of cold. Elias wondered what it was seeking. It didn't seem predatory. Its pace was too leisurely, too calm. It seemed almost contemplative, as if it were browsing the forest, tasting the air currents. The anomaly reached the valley floor, where the colder night air naturally settled, but even against this cooler background, the object remained starkly, impossibly defined. A piece of deepest winter floating through an autumn night. As it reached the flat terrain of the valley, the anomaly paused again. Elias held his breath, watching. Then, a subtle shift occurred. The single, unified shape began to elongate, stretching out horizontally. It reminded Elias of a cell dividing under a microscope. Slowly, silently, the single patch of intense cold pulled apart into two distinct, smaller spheres of identical deep blue. They hovered side by side for a moment, perfectly synchronized, before slowly drifting apart, widening the distance between them. Now there were two cold shadows patrolling the forest floor. The two shapes moved independently now, yet with a sense of coordinated purpose, like silent partners in a slow dance. One drifted toward the creek bed, following the winding path of the water. The other moved toward the edge of the meadow where Elias often saw deer grazing. They moved with the same impossible smoothness, gliding just above the ferns and undergrowth, never disturbing a leaf. Elias found the sight oddly soothing. It was a gentle mystery, unfurling at a pace that invited contemplation rather than alarm. The forest was full of things he didn't understand. This was just a new, quieter stanza in its ancient song. He watched the one near the creek. It paused by a large boulder. On the thermal screen, The boulder was a warm, glowing yellow rock. The cold blue sphere hovered right next to it. Elias watched as the thermal signature of the rock's surface nearest the anomaly began to change. The warm yellow faded, cooling rapidly to green, then blue, as if the heat was being siphoned off, absorbed by the hovering shadow. It was a gentle exchange of energy, a silent interaction between the stone and the unknown visitor. After a few minutes, the shadow moved on, and the rock slowly began to regain its warmth from the earth beneath it. Elias realized his own breathing had slowed to match the deliberate pace of the shadows on his screen. The cabin felt safer, cozier, in contrast to the profound cold he was witnessing outside. He was a silent spectator in a theater of temperature and slow movement. The second shadow had reached the meadow and was now drifting in wide, lazy circles, like a hawk riding a thermal updraft, only this was a downdraft of supercooled air. It seemed to be mapping the area, or perhaps just enjoying the open space. There was a playful quality to its movements now, a lack of urgency that was deeply calming to watch. He checked the time. 2 hours had passed since he first spotted the anomaly on the ridge. It felt like minutes. The hypnotic quality of watching the silent, cold shapes had warped his sense of time. They were currently about half a mile from his cabin and showing no sign of moving closer. They seemed content in the valley. Elias felt a strange sense of privilege. How many people in human history had witnessed something like this? He was alone with a phenomenon that defied explanation, and it was peaceful. It was a gift of the taken hour, the time when the rest of the world was absent. The two shadows began to converge again, moving from their separate explorations back toward a central point near the creek. They met and hovered near each other, two pockets of absolute cold against the ambient cool of the woods. They didn't merge back into one, but maintained a polite distance, orbiting each other slowly. It looked like a greeting or a silent exchange of information. Elias imagined them communicating in frequencies too low or too high for any earthly creature to hear, sharing the sensory data of the creek bed and the meadow in a language of pure temperature. After their silent conference, the two shapes turned in unison and began to move again. This time, their trajectory had changed. They were no longer moving parallel to the cabin. They were moving slowly, deliberately, in his direction. They were still far out in the valley, but the path they were carving through the thermal landscape led toward the rise where his outpost stood. Elias felt a ripple of anticipation, not fear. He felt like a host whose quiet guests were finally making their way to the reception area. He adjusted his chair, sitting up a little straighter, preparing for their approach. They moved up the gentle slope leading out of the valley, navigating the terrain with the same effortless glide. They didn't weave around trees, they passed between them, sometimes seeming to pass right through the thinner brush without slowing down. Their approach was steady and unhurried. As they got closer, Elias could see them more clearly on the screen. They were perfect spheres of uniform, cold, dense and opaque to the thermal sensor. They were about the size of beach balls, he estimated. 2 bubbles of negative energy floating up the hill. He wondered if they could sense him. Could they feel the warmth of the cabin, the heat leaking from the windows and the vent of his small stove? Were they attracted to it, like moths to a flame? Or was it just another topographical feature on their journey? They were 300 yards away now. Elias turned off the cabin's interior lights, plunging the room into darkness save for the glow of the monitors. It felt appropriate to meet them in the dark. The silence in the cabin deepened. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a soft ocean sound in the quiet room. 200 yards. They crossed the perimeter line of the clearing that surrounded the outpost. Now there were no trees between them and the cabin, just open ground covered in low scrub. On the thermal screen, the clearing was a flat plain of cool blue. The 2 intense indigo spheres stood out starkly against it. They didn't speed up or slow down. Their approach was mathematically constant. Elias placed his hands flat on the console, feeling the slight vibration of the equipment. He was completely present in the moment, every sense tuned to the silent arrival outside. 100 yards. They separated slightly, one moving toward the left side of the cabin, the other to the right. They were going to flank the structure. Elias calmly panned another camera, one mounted on the corner of the building, to get a better view of the left side. The sphere glided into the frame, a perfect circle of anti-heat. It came to a stop about 20 feet from the wall, hovering just above the ground. The second sphere did the same on the opposite side. They had surrounded the outpost, and then they just waited. Elias sat in the center of the darkened cabin, flanked by the monitors showing his silent visitors. He was encased in warmth and light, while just outside, 2 points of intense, impossible cold stood sentinel. There was no aggression in their posture, if a sphere could have posture. There was only a profound stillness. He felt a strange sense of connection, a silent communion across the barrier of the cabin walls and the even greater barrier of their alien natures. He wasn't scared. He felt peaceful and incredibly awake. Minutes passed in absolute silence. The wind outside had died down completely. The only movement on the screens was the subtle digital refresh rate. Elias realized that the usual background noise of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, was absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem had paused out of respect, or perhaps caution, for the visitors. The silence was thick and heavy, like a warm blanket. He watched the spheres, and they, it seemed, watched him back, with sensors he couldn't begin to imagine. Then, slowly, the sphere on the left began to rise. It floated straight up, parallel to the cabin wall, until it was level with the roofline. It moved slowly over the roof, directly above where Elias was sitting. He instinctively looked up at the ceiling, though he could see nothing but wooden planks. On the main monitor, The thermal camera on the roof looked straight down. A large, perfect circle of deep blue blocked the view, hovering just inches above the lens. It was inspecting the equipment that had been watching it. The sphere lingered over the camera for a long moment. Elias watched the temperature readout of the camera itself begin to drop. It wasn't freezing, but it was cooling rapidly, influenced by the proximity of the intense cold. Then, just as smoothly as it had arrived, the sphere lifted away, moving back out over the clearing. The second sphere on the right side of the cabin joined it. They rendezvoused in front of the cabin, hovering side by side once more. The inspection was over. Without ceremony, the two shapes began to move away, retracing their path back toward the valley. Elias watched them go. He felt a pang of melancholy, a sense of loss at their departure. Their visit had been so brief, so cryptic, yet it had profoundly altered his night. He watched them until they were just small blue dots on the distant tree line, and then they were gone, absorbed back into the deeper mystery of the woods. The forest, released from their presence, seemed to exhale. A breeze rustled the trees near the cabin, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. Elias turned the cabin lights back on. The sudden brightness was jarring. He looked around his familiar workspace. The charts, the empty coffee mug, the stack of books. Everything was the same, yet everything felt different. He had made contact. Not with a handshake or a spoken word, but with a shared moment of silent coexistence. He sat back down at the console and finally opened his logbook. He picked up his pen, hovered it over the paper, and then put it back down. There were no words for this in the standard operating procedure. He decided to simply watch. He turned his chair to face the window, looking out into the true dark, unaided by thermal sensors. He couldn't see them anymore, but he knew they were out there, cool shadows drifting through the night. A profound sense of peace settled over him, a feeling that the universe was far stranger, quieter, and more beautiful than he had ever imagined. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of the blue spheres drift in his mind, a calming visualization that pulled him gently toward sleep, ready to see what the next night would bring. The following evening arrived with a slate-gray sky that promised a deeper, heavier darkness. Elias had spent the daylight hours in a haze of quiet anticipation, reviewing the previous night's recordings. The data confirmed what his eyes had seen: distinct, coherent pockets of sub-zero temperature moving with intent. Now, as the twilight faded into the true black of night, he sat at his console, the familiar hum of the electronics acting as a grounding mantra. He wasn't anxious. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by a patient curiosity, a desire to simply be present for whatever chapter the forest decided to write next. He poured a fresh cup of tea, the steam rising in a gentle spiral, and turned his gaze to the glowing monitors. The forest cooled down rapidly. On the thermal display, the vibrant yellows and oranges of the sun-soaked earth faded into the soothing purples and blues of the nocturnal landscape. It was like watching a fever break, the land settling into a comfortable, cool resting state. Elias scanned the usual sectors. The deer were bedding down near the western ridge, huddled together as a single, warm, fuzzy mass on the screen. The owl was hunting, a sharp, bright streak of heat diving and rising in the canopy. The rhythms were intact, but Elias was looking for the anomaly, for the void in the pattern. He kept one monitor dedicated to a wide-angle scan, searching for that telltale velvet blackness. Hours slipped by. The digital clock shifted from 10 to 11, then toward midnight. The waiting was part of the ritual. In the silence, Elias found his mind wandering pleasantly, drifting through thoughts as formless as clouds. Just as his attention began to fray, a subtle change occurred on the eastern perimeter monitor. It wasn't the dramatic arrival of the previous night. It was softer. A small patch of the creek, usually a consistent cool green, suddenly deepened to a stark navy blue. The water temperature at that specific bend had dropped, plummeting in seconds. They were back, but they had emerged from the water itself. Elias leaned in, his breath hitching slightly. From the darkened patch of water, a shape detached itself. It rose from the surface, a perfect sphere of cold, shedding the thermal signature of the water like a second skin. It hovered above the creek bed, silent and majestic. Then another sphere emerged, and another. 3 of them tonight. They floated in a triangular formation, rotating slowly around a central axis. The precision was mesmerizing. They looked like a constellation of dark stars brought down to earth, navigating the low currents of the river valley with an eerie grace. They began to move upstream, against the flow of the water. Elias tracked them with the motorized camera. Their movement was different tonight. It was less exploratory and more purposeful. They were weaving through the willow branches that hung over the water, passing through the leaves without disturbing them. On the thermal screen, it looked as though they were stitching the air, trailing a faint wake of cooler air behind them that lingered for moments before dissipating. They were changing the microclimate of the forest simply by passing through it, painting the air with cold. As they moved, Elias noticed they seemed drawn to specific areas. One sphere broke formation and drifted toward a large, rotting log on the bank. Decaying wood often generates heat, appearing as a warm, faint glow on the thermal scope. The cold sphere hovered directly over the log. Slowly, the warm glow of the decay faded, neutralized by the proximity of the sphere. It was as if the entity was soothing the earth, cooling a fevered spot. After a moment, the sphere rejoined its companions. Elias realized he might not be watching explorers, but caretakers, custodians of the temperature. The idea brought a profound sense of comfort to Elias. The forest wasn't just wild and chaotic, it was being tended to. These silent, cold gardeners were patrolling the night, balancing the thermal scales. The trio continued their journey upstream, eventually drawing closer to the bridge that marked the halfway point to the cabin. Elias felt a desire to bridge the gap between observer and observed. He didn't want to interfere, but he wanted to offer a gesture of acknowledgement. He looked at his own mug of tea, now cooling on the desk. Heat. That was the currency of this interaction. He stood up and went to the small kitchenette in the corner of the cabin. He filled a heavy ceramic bowl with boiling water from the kettle. It was a simple, harmless beacon. He walked to the cabin door, unlocked it quietly, and stepped out onto the small wooden porch. The night air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. He placed the steaming bowl on the railing, the heat radiating from it palpable against his skin. He stepped back inside, locked the door, and returned to his monitors. On the screen, the bowl on the porch was a brilliant, blinding star of white-hot intensity. He waited. On the monitors, the three spheres paused near the bridge. They had sensed it. The intense point source of heat was impossible to miss in the cool night. Slowly, the triangular formation rotated, orienting itself toward the cabin. They began to approach, not with the tentative caution of the previous night, but with a direct, smooth glide. They ascended the slope, moving over the ferns and rocks, their dark forms growing larger on the screen. Elias held his breath. He wasn't luring them. He was inviting them. They reached the edge of the clearing. The leader of the trio moved ahead, drifting straight toward the porch. It stopped a few feet from the railing, hovering at eye level with the steaming bowl. The other two flanked it, waiting. Elias watched the thermal readout of the water. It was dropping rapidly. The sphere moved closer until it was almost enveloping the bowl. The white-hot glare on the screen began to dim, turning to orange, then yellow, then a neutral green. They were absorbing the heat, drinking it. It happened in silence, and with incredible speed. Within a minute, the water, which had been boiling, was indistinguishable from the ambient air temperature on the screen. The sphere backed away, rejoining its companions. It seemed slightly larger now, or perhaps just denser, its dark blue color even more profound. Elias felt a strange ripple of gratitude. His offering had been accepted. It wasn't a predation. It was a transaction of energy. He had provided warmth, and they had taken it, leaving the coolness of the night in exchange. The three spheres did not leave immediately. They lingered around the cabin, drifting past the windows. Elias sat very still. One of the spheres moved to the large window directly in front of his console. Even though he couldn't see it with his naked eye through the glass, the thermal monitor showed it hovering just inches from the pane. He could feel a chill radiating through the glass, a localized cold front pressing against the warmth of his sanctuary. He slowly raised his hand and pressed his palm against the window. On the thermal screen, the image was striking. The warm, intricate map of veins and heat in his hand was pressed against the glass. And on the other side, the absolute void of the cold sphere met it. separated only by a half-inch of glazing. He felt the cold seeping through the glass, numbing his fingertips. But it wasn't painful. It was a numbing, anesthetic sensation, like touching smooth ice. For a moment, human biology and alien physics touched, sharing a quiet, motionless high five across the barrier of worlds. Elias kept his hand there until the cold became too penetrating. Then he slowly pulled back. The sphere lingered for a moment longer, as if savoring the fading warmth of the handprint on the glass, and then drifted away. It rejoined the other two, and the trio resumed their patrol pattern, moving away from the cabin and back toward the tree line. Elias rubbed his chilled hand, feeling the blood rush back into the fingers. He felt incredibly awake, yet deeply calm. The encounter had been intimate, a silent conversation of touch and temperature. He watched them go until they were swallowed by the vastness of the forest. He realized that he was no longer just a passive observer. He had become a participant in the ecosystem of the night. The forest felt different to him now, not a wall of darkness, but a living, breathing entity where heat and cold danced in a complex, beautiful balance. He felt safe, protected even. The cold shadows were out there, keeping the fever of the world at bay. The rest of the night passed without incident. Elias busied himself with minor tasks, calibrating sensors and logging weather data, but his mind remained on the visitors. He found himself checking the external temperature readings more frequently. The air around the cabin remained slightly cooler than the rest of the valley for hours, a lingering ghost of their presence. It was a refreshing chill, crisp and clean. As the first hint of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky, turning the black to a bruised purple, Elias prepared to end his shift. He saved the night's recordings to a secure drive. He labeled the file simply Exchange. He washed the ceramic bowl, which was now cold to the touch, and placed it back on the shelf. The ritual of cleaning up helped him transition back to the mundane world. But as he packed his bag to leave the outpost for the day shift forester, he knew he would be counting the hours until sunset. The night had become the true reality. The day merely a waiting room. Sleep that day came easily for Elias. He dreamt of floating in a vast, cool ocean, weightless and serene. The anxiety of daily life, the noise of the human world, all of it was washed away by the silent, blue currents of his dreams. When he woke in the late afternoon, the shadows were already lengthening. The sun was a heavy orange ball sinking toward the trees. He felt a pull, a magnetic attraction to the outpost. He drove up the winding gravel road, the anticipation building in his chest like a rising tide. Arriving at the cabin, he went through the handover with the day ranger, a chatty young man who complained about the humidity and the insects. Elias nodded, smiling politely, listening to the descriptions of a world that felt completely separate from his own. The day forest was loud, hot, and chaotic. The night forest was cool, silent, and ordered. As the ranger's truck taillights disappeared down the track, Elias locked the door and let out a long breath. He was home. He turned off the overhead lights and powered up the thermal array. Tonight, the atmosphere felt heavy. The air was thick and still, charged with the potential for a storm. The thermal sensors showed the ground retaining a massive amount of heat from the day. The forest floor was a carpet of glowing orange. It was too hot. The balance was off. Elias wondered if the gardeners would be more active tonight, if their work was cut out for them. He settled into his chair, the darkness of the room wrapping around him like a familiar coat. He scanned the ridge. Nothing yet. The storm broke an hour later, not with rain, but with wind. Warm, gusty winds that whipped the treetops and confused the thermal sensors with shifting air currents. The screens were a chaotic mess of blurred colors. Elias struggled to find a stable image. He worried that the turbulence would mask the arrival of the shadows. He focused on the ground level, where the wind was less severe. He scanned the dense thickets of rhododendron, looking for the stillness within the motion. And then he saw them. Not 3, and not 2, a dozen. They were emerging from the ground itself, rising from the root systems of the great oaks in the valley. Small spheres, no larger than softballs, drifting upward like bubbles in a glass of champagne. They clustered together, merging and separating in a fluid dance. They weren't bothered by the wind. They seemed to exist on a different plane of physical laws, unaffected by the gusts that thrashed the branches around them. The swarm of cold spheres moved toward the center of the valley. They coalesced into a large, swirling ring, rotating counterclockwise. It was a vortex of cold air, a hurricane of temperature growing in the heart of the warm, windy night. Elias watched in awe. The temperature reading at the center of the valley began to plummet. They were creating a cold front. They were manufacturing a weather system. The chaotic heat of the ground was being sucked into this rotating engine of cold. As the ring spun faster, the wind in the valley began to die down. The artificial cold front was stabilizing the air pressure. The swaying of the trees slowed and stopped. The gardeners were calming the storm. It was a display of power that was both terrifying and benevolent. Elias realized the scope of what he was watching. This wasn't just a local phenomenon. This was planetary maintenance happening in his backyard. He felt incredibly small, but also incredibly privileged. The ring dispersed. The spheres scattered, drifting off in all directions to perform their individual tasks. The crisis was averted. The forest was cool and quiet once again. Elias leaned back, exhausted by the sheer magnitude of the event. He realized he hadn't taken a sip of his tea in over an hour. He picked up the mug. It was stone cold. He smiled. It seemed appropriate. One of the smaller spheres detached from the dispersing group and headed toward the outpost. Elias recognized the movement. It was the inquisitive one from the night before, the one that had touched the glass. It floated up to the window again. This time, Elias didn't raise his hand. He simply nodded. The sphere bobbed slightly, a gesture that felt like a return of the greeting. It hovered there, a silent companion in the quiet aftermath of the wind. He wondered if they had a name, or if they needed one. Names were for things that needed to be categorized, controlled. These beings were elemental. They were the shadows of the Kelvin, the ghosts of absolute zero. He decided to call them simply the Cool. It felt right, a soft, non-threatening name for a soft, non-threatening presence. The Cool lingered for a while, casting a soothing blue glow on the monitor, before drifting off to join its kin. The rest of the night was a blur of peaceful observation. Elias watched the forest breathe, the thermal colors shifting slowly with the hours. He felt a deep connection to the rhythm of the cooling earth. It was a lullaby of physics, a song sung in infrared. He found his eyelids growing heavy, the gentle blinking of the cursor acting as a metronome for his drowsy mind. He was safe here. The world was being looked after. As dawn approached, the birds began their morning chorus, a sound that usually signaled the end of his shift. But today, it felt like a gentle intrusion, a reminder that the magic hour was closing. The thermal landscape began to wash out as the sun's rays hit the upper canopy, turning the cool blues back into the warming grays and yellows of day. The secret world was retreating, hiding within the light, waiting for the cover of darkness to return. Elias packed his bag with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. He stepped out onto the porch, the morning air cool and fresh. He looked at the spot where the bowl had sat, then at the window where the handprint had been. Invisible traces of a midnight friendship. He walked to his car, the gravel crunching under his boots, ready to sleep through the noisy day, dreaming of the blue silence that awaited him. The forest kept its secrets, and now, so did he. The wheel of the year turned slowly, grinding the vibrant greens of summer into the brittle browns and grays of late autumn. For Elias, this transition was most visible on his screens. The forest floor, once a quilt of varying temperatures, began to equalize. The ground lost its stored heat more rapidly, and the thermal landscape became a sea of cool purples and soft, muted blues. The distinct contrast that had made the visitors so easy to spot was fading. The world was becoming more like them. Elias had to watch closer, tuning the sensitivity of his instruments to catch the subtle variances in the deepening chill. He worried, briefly, that they had left, that perhaps they were migratory creatures of the ether, following the temperate weather south. But then, on a particularly still Tuesday,
he saw them. They were no longer floating high above the canopy or patrolling the open meadows. They were hugging the earth, moving low through the fallen leaves. They appeared as faint, ghostly smudges of darker blue against the violet ground. They were blending in, camouflaged by the season itself. They weren't leaving, they were settling in. They were becoming part of the forest's winter coat. The first hard frost arrived on a night of diamond-hard clarity. The air was so still it felt solid. Elias watched as the temperature readout outside the cabin dropped steadily. 30 degrees, 25, 20. On the optical camera, the world was pitch black. But on the thermal screen, a miracle was happening. As the frost formed on the trees, releasing a tiny, microscopic amount of latent heat, the forest glittered. It was a sparkling dust of faint warmth. And moving through this glittering field were the shadows, sweeping up the excess energy, polishing the frost until it was perfectly cold. Elias found that he needed the monitors less and less to know where they were. He developed a sense for it, a kind of thermal intuition. When the hair on his arms stood up, or when a sudden, inexplicable peace settled over the cabin, he knew they were near. He would look at the screen, and sure enough, a dark sphere would be drifting past the perimeter. The barrier between the man and the phenomenon was thinning. He was no longer just an observer. He was a neighbor, living on the same quiet street of the universe. One night, the snow began. It didn't storm, it simply fell, huge, soft flakes drifting down in straight lines. On the thermal imaging, falling snow is a mesmerizing, chaotic static, a curtain of cool dots falling against the background. It usually obscures everything, but tonight, the snow seemed to part around specific areas. Elias watched as empty pockets of air moved through the falling curtain. The shadows were there, invisible bubbles of force, and the snow was sliding around their spherical forms, outlining them in negative space. It was a ballet of white noise and silence. The snow piled up, insulating the cabin, turning it into a buried bunker of warmth. The silence of a snow-covered forest is heavy and absolute. Sound is dampened, absorbed by the powder. Elias felt swaddled in cotton. He turned off the main overhead lights, preferring the amber glow of a single desk lamp. The thermal screens cast a soft, aquatic light into the room. He felt like he was in a submarine, navigating the depths of a frozen ocean. The visitors were out there, swimming in the currents of the blizzard, completely in their element. He realized that the cool were not just reducing heat, they were preserving. By slowing down the molecules, by freezing the forest, they were placing it into a state of suspended animation. They were the guardians of the pause, the keepers of the long winter sleep. They ensured that the trees rested, that the seeds waited, that the earth gathered its strength for the distant spring. Their cold was not a force of death, but a form of patience. Elias watched them hover over a buried sapling, protecting its dormancy. The days grew shorter, until they were little more than brief, gray interludes between the long stretches of night. Elias adjusted his sleep schedule, waking later, staying up deeper into the dark hours. He felt his own internal rhythm slowing down, matching the heartbeat of the woods. His movements in the cabin became deliberate and unhurried. He brewed his tea slower. He turned pages quietly. He was hibernating in his own way, his metabolism syncing with the entities outside. The urgency of the human world felt like a distant memory, a radio station he could no longer tune into. On the night of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, the activity peaked. The screens were filled with them. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of the dark spheres gathered in the valley. They didn't spin or dance this time. They simply covered the forest floor, a blanket of living shadow laid over the blanket of snow. They were deepening the winter, locking in the cold. It was a ceremony of stasis. Elias watched with reverence. It was the most peaceful thing he had ever seen. A massive, collective effort to simply be still. As the solstice night wore on, the thermal distinction between the shadows and the environment vanished completely. The air temperature dropped to match them. The forest had achieved equilibrium. The visitors were no longer visible because the world had become them. They had successfully merged with the season. Elias stared at the screen, which showed a uniform, perfect, deep blue. There were no more anomalies. There was just the winter. The work was done. He turned off the monitors. One by one, the blue windows into the night winked out, leaving only the darkness of the room and the amber pool of his lamp. He didn't need to see them anymore. He knew they were there, in every snowflake, in every frozen branch, in the biting air that pressed against the walls. They were the spirit of the season, and they were resting. Elias felt a profound sense of completion. The mystery hadn't been solved, but it had been accepted. And that was better. He walked to the window and wiped away a small circle of condensation. Outside, the moon had risen, casting a pale, silver light on the snow. The forest was a sculpture of white marble. It was motionless, silent, and breathtakingly beautiful. He thought about the heat of the summer, the noise of the insects, the chaotic energy of growth. That would return in time, but for now, the reign of the cool was absolute. And it was good. It was a time to rest. Elias made his final entry in the logbook. He didn't write about spheres or thermal anomalies. He simply wrote, "Winter has arrived. The forest is sleeping soundly." He closed the book and ran his hand over the leather cover. His shift at the outpost would continue, but the watch was over. There was nothing left to track. The guardians were not intruders. They were the immune system of the wild, and they had done their job. He felt a heavy, warm drowsiness settle into his bones. He prepared for bed. The routine was familiar, comforting. He checked the door lock, though he knew nothing would disturb him. He banked the small wood stove, ensuring the fire would burn slowly through the night. The crackle of the wood was the only sound in the world. He was alone, yet he felt surrounded by a vast, silent family. The cold outside was a blanket that held the warmth inside, a necessary contrast that made the cabin feel like a womb. Elias lay down and pulled the heavy quilt up to his chin. The mattress was soft, the pillow cool against his cheek. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the image of the blue spheres. He imagined them out there, thousands of them, hovering motionless in the dark, watching over the sleeping seeds and the dreaming roots. He visualized himself as one of them, a sphere of peaceful cold, floating weightless in the void, untethered and free. His breathing slowed, deepening into the rhythm of deep sleep. In and out, warmth and cool. The tension of the observation, the vigilance of the watcher, melted away. He was no longer Elias the forester. He was just a breathing part of the night. The boundary between his mind and the forest dissolved. He could feel the snow settling on the roof, adding its weight to the shelter. He could feel the frost knitting the soil together. He was part of the great hibernation. The darkness behind his eyelids was not empty. It was rich and velvety. It was the color of the thermal anomalies, a deep, nourishing indigo. It was the color of deep ocean water, of the sky between stars. It washed over him, soothing every nerve, quieting every thought. There was no need to think. There was only the sensation of drifting. Drifting like the shadows, smooth and silent, over the treetops of his consciousness. The memories of the day, of the weeks, of the years, receded into the distance. They were small, warm islands left behind as he sailed into the cool, dark sea of sleep. The mysteries of the universe were not meant to be solved tonight. They were meant to be slept through. The answers would be there in the spring, or they wouldn't. It didn't matter. Now was the time for the questions to rest, too. He felt a phantom sensation of cool glass against his palm, the memory of that first contact. It was a promise. We are here. We are watching. You can rest. The message echoed in the chambers of his mind, a silent lullaby sung by the physics of the universe. He accepted the permission. He let go of the last thread of alertness. The rope slipped from his fingers, and he floated free. The cabin stood silent on the hill. The monitors were black. The forest was white. The air was still. Inside, the man slept, his dreams painted in shades of blue and thermal orange. Outside, the shadows held their vigil, invisible and eternal, wrapping the world in a protective embrace of 0 degrees. The balance was held. The night was taken. And in that taken hour, everything was exactly as it should be. As we reach the end of our journey tonight, let yourself follow Elias into that deep winter rest. Imagine your own body becoming heavy, sinking into the mattress like the snow settling on the earth.
The cool air of the room is a blanket on your skin, fresh and clean. The warmth of your covers is a sanctuary, a cabin in the woods of your own making. You are safe here. You are protected. Feel the muscles in your face relax, smoothing out like the surface of a frozen lake. Let your shoulders drop, releasing the weight of the day. Let that relaxation flow down your arms, into your hands, the same hands that can let go of everything now. There is nothing you need to track, nothing you need to record. The monitors are off. The work is done. Breathe in the stillness. Breathe out the noise. In the quiet of your own mind, you can find the shadows of the Kelvin, those peaceful, cooling presences that slow down the chaotic energy of thoughts. Let them drift through your mind, absorbing the worries, absorbing the heat of the day, leaving behind only a cool, clear silence. A silence that is perfect for sleep. Drift deeper now, down into the valley of sleep. The trees are standing guard around you. The stars are watching overhead. The earth is holding you up. You are part of this ancient system of rest. It is a cycle that has repeated for millions of years, and tonight, you are simply taking your place in it, resting, recharging, waiting. The cold is not harsh. It is preserving. It keeps you safe. Imagine that deep, indigo blue filling your vision. It is the color of heavy eyelids. It is the color of the deep ocean. It is the color of the space where dreams begin. Let yourself float in it, weightless, timeless, without a destination. Sleep comes not as a stranger, but as a friend you have known forever. It approaches like the spheres, silent and smooth. It hovers over you, offering peace. You accept it. You invite it in. You feel the edges of your consciousness softening, blurring, dissolving into the great, comfortable dark. Everything is slow. Everything is quiet. The forest of your mind is covered in snow. Peaceful, white, silent snow. No wind disturbs the branches. No footprints mar the surface. It is a clean slate, a fresh start waiting for you on the other side of the night. But that is for later. For now, there is only the snow and the sleep. Go there now, to the cabin in the snow, to the warm bed, to the heavy quilt, to the silence. Let the story of the day end here. Let the next chapter be written in dreams. You are the observer, and you are the observed. You are the keeper of the taken hour. Good night, traveler. Good night, watcher. May your rest be as deep as the winter, and your dreams as clear as the frost. The universe is holding you. The stars are singing a lullaby of light. Sleep well.